Welcome everyone to the European School of Theosophy. And we take this opportunity to thank the Blavatsky Trust for their continued support. My name is Erika Georgiadis and I'm part of the team of the school. The school was founded in 1981 by Geoffrey Farthing and other Theosophists. This year, we will focus on the study of the Secret Doctrine. We will also be offering lectures, online courses, and seminars on a variety of topics. In a total of 170 lectures, 15 online courses and seminars, plus the publication we are working on, which is the Lucifer collection. So we are offering a lot of activities this year, and we would suggest you registering for our weekly newsletter so you can keep updated on our program and not miss anything. The UST is a not-for-profit platform, and the large majority of our programs are free of charge. So please support the work, if you can, by making a donation. Our online lectures, but not seminars, are also transmitted live on our YouTube channel, and you can register to our channel by visiting the link you will see on the chat. Today, we are honored with a lecture by the International President of the Theosophical Society, Adyar, Tim Boyd, entitled The Practice of Inspiration. Next Saturday, we will continue with the seminar with Dr. Ravindra, focusing on the Bhagavad Gita. Next Sunday, the lecture will be Life in Hidden Dimensions by Tim White. Please check the UST newsletter for details. The UST's beautiful version of Practical Vegetarian Cookery from 1897, written by Countess Weichmaster and Kate Davis, the first vegetarian book published in California, with an introduction by the president of the International Vegetarian Union, has been republished by us and is now available online on Amazon. But hot off from the presses is the first volume of the much anticipated Lucifer collection, entitled Poetry, Aphorisms, and Proverbs, compiled from Lucifer magazine, a must-have, also available on Amazon. Finally, the second volume of the Lucifer collection, entitled Last Song of the Swan, will be released in 1 week from now and presents all editorials, all notes of the unpopular philosopher, all editorial notes, as well as the financial reports of Lucifer magazine. This is a volume of almost 700 pages. Having said that, the way that today's meeting will be conducted is that your microphones will be muted, and you will not be able to unmute yourself. After the lecture, if you would like to ask a question, you can either write it on the chat or use the raise hand option. Your microphone will be then unmuted. Today, we will open only for 3 questions. Please, if you need to leave the conference room during the lecture, please do so without announcing it on the chat so as to not disturb the proceedings. Thank you for listening. Now, it is my honor to introduce our special guest speaker, Tim Boyd. In 1974, he joined the Theosophical Society in America, together with Bill Lawrence, a TES member, and others. He founded a Theosophical spiritual community in Chicago's inner city. The group formed the Royal Associates. The organizations helped stabilize neighborhoods through the training and employment of local youth and the creation of affordable homes for area residents. In 1988, he started as a national lecturer of the TSA From 1996 to 2000, he worked in hospice services as a volunteer in a team that involved doctors, social workers, and nurses. In 2007, Boyd became president of the Theosophical Order of Service, USA. He also played basketball in the team Theosophical. He was also president of the Theosophical Society in America for many years. In 2014, he was elected president of the Theosophical Society Adyar, and now he is in the process of being re-elected and reconfirmed as the international president for another 7 years term. So congratulations are in order. Welcome, Tim, once more. And now I pass the words to you.
Well, thank you very much, Erica. Thank you for inviting me to participate in the European Schools program. Anyway, it's very good to be here. I am a little bit, it's interesting how, having done an interview with Erica just a few weeks ago, I'm reminded about ancient times of playing basketball under the name of the Theosophias, a basketball team we took to Mexico for another time. But it's very good to be here and to be able to share some thoughts. One of the things that has occurred during the course of this pandemic moment has been that the sort of interactions we had become accustomed to, we had to shift. And I have to say that I'm very, very much pleased with the way in which community has continued to be established in various places, the European School being one of the foremost. So it's very good to actually be a part of it with you all here today. And I wanted to talk a little bit, just share some thoughts about something that should be a familiar subject to all of us. Certainly, I would believe that anyone who has found their way to the study of theosophy or to the idea that it is in fact possible to extend consciousness would be familiar with inspiration. Although it's one of those things that can be a little bit slippery in terms of our ability to grasp it. What I wanted to talk a little bit about today was, in fact, a practice or the practice of inspiration, the practice of being in the presence of the influence of that which inspires. So, two things. Obviously, we're going to talk about inspiration, but also I think a little attention would be well to be given to the whole subject of practice itself. I don't know if it's true for all of the various countries who are joining in this meeting, but I do know growing up in the United States, a very familiar expression that I heard was that practice makes perfect. And probably that's one of those things that cuts across cultures. The idea that at an early stage is impressed upon us that practice makes perfect. The theory behind it being that repetition tends to ingrain certain behaviors, and that if you repeat it sufficiently, then that behavior becomes perfected. That's the theory. I think that if we give a little bit of thought to it, there's probably more nuance to that than as it is expressed, because obviously just any form of practice doesn't lead to the perfection that we imagine. I'm a witness of this. Long ago, when my basketball career ended, having been a person who enjoyed sports and activity, I had to switch sports because I enjoyed it. And I found myself playing tennis. And early on, I found that I could serve the ball very fast. And so what I did, the motion that it took to serve the ball in that manner, I just practiced it and practiced it and practiced it over a summer. By the time the summer was ending, my serve was getting weaker. My shoulder was hurting me. And in fact, my method of practice was not using proper mechanics. And as a result, I damaged my shoulder. All engaged in this theory that practice will make this serve perfect. It doesn't in that sense. I knew when I came to Chicago, I had the opportunity to meet with some very profound people, spiritual students, some of them lifelong spiritual students. And there was one man I remember who was just kind of renowned for his knowledge of metaphysical things. Came a time in his life where he ran into some difficult times, and we invited him to come live with us. And there was a community of us living in Chicago at that time. Felt it would be beneficial to him and would also be beneficial to us to be able to imbibe some of this lifetime of wisdom and practice. In a sense, it was remarkable because he was, in fact, almost encyclopedic in his knowledge of the various texts and various sorts of spiritual matters. But we had the practice every morning of, as a group, we would have a meditation period. And came to find out that this gentleman, although all of his life he had been involved in study, his concept of meditation was nothing more than the repetition of specific affirmations. And the whole process of quieting the mind was something that completely eluded him during a lifetime of practice. He was 80 years old. So these were things that kind of opened my eyes, that practice in and of itself does not make perfect. Perfect practice or proper practice does. So the key, I think, for us is not just the repetition of things or behaviors or the repetitive ideas that we allowed to cross through our mind, but the proper choice and proper attention to those things. Because basically what we're doing is we are creating habits. That's all that practice is. It is repetition of the body, of the emotions, of the mind, to create a certain sort of habit. The difference between our ordinary living and specific practice is awareness, attention, consciousness. Because the fact of the matter is we're always practicing. During the course of every single day, we are rehearsing patterns of behavior. Whether or not they are productive to our unfoldment is another issue. But I think every body is always in the process of practicing. Often, we are practicing the best methods to express our anger. We are practicing, almost everyone who watches the news at night has moments where they are practicing awakening feelings of fear and danger. All of these things are repetitive behaviors that we find ourselves engaging in, but unconsciously. And it's the unconscious aspect that separates it from a viable approach to unfoldment. There's this idea that habit is overcome by habit. So in this process of creating new or different habits, this is what we tend to engage in. Now, if we're going to be completely honest about it, any habit, ultimately, whether we call it a good habit or a bad habit, any habit limits, restricts the consciousness, so long as it's something that we find ourselves just completely immersed in. But it's paradoxical in a way, because in a sense, though habit is limiting, also it is an avenue to freedom. For instance, I mean, anybody who has been engaged in sports or in music or in cooking, when you're first doing those things, if you learned to drive, when you first learned how to drive, it was an exercise in intense concentration. I know when I was trying to teach my daughter to drive, there were moments where her concentration was such that she would be gripping the wheel and almost sweating from having to focus on so many different things. I have to say, too, that as the person who was sitting in the seat next to her, I, too, was sometimes sweating, but for a different reason. But this concentration that is required as we are learning to master or to completely develop a skill is what happens in the beginning. Once we have reached a point where we have developed that, then it becomes something that really is completely unconscious. Anyone who knows how to drive can drive and listen to the radio, have a conversation, watch what's going on the street, and still drive. So in a sense, the restriction of our attention develops a certain capacity that leads to a greater freedom. And we find this, we're talking about driving and we're talking about all those sorts of things, but we actually find it most pronounced in terms of the cultivation and the unfoldment of consciousness. When we talk about meditation, there is the axiom that HPB very frequently referred us to in saying that this is something that anyone who is genuinely involved in a spiritual path or in a desire to understand Theosophy, the ageless wisdom, she would refer us to this idea of the Hermetic axiom, which is to say that as it is without, so it is within. As it is above, so it is below. So analogy, we learn from observing and the analogies from outer processes to inner processes. The analogy I'd share with you at the moment is I think this is something that probably for most of us in early years of school, science experiments involving magnets. And magnetism is a force that can be described scientifically, although it's not necessarily completely understood. But with a magnet, it has the capacity to attract to itself materials that are subject to this sort of magnetism. So much so that if it were to touch a nail, just an ordinary piece of iron, that just in touching that piece of metal, the piece of metal itself then becomes able to touch other things and attract them to it. So the nail becomes magnetized so long as it is in contact with this magnet. So in a sense, we will be talking about inspiration and the process of inspiration, but to the extent that we are in contact with some magnetic, some higher source, we also become similarly charged. Remove us from the presence of that source, and that magnetism goes away. But in speaking about practice, there is this fact that many of us probably became aware of in grade school science class, that you can take a piece of metal and it can become a magnet. And I think this is the thing that speaks to practice. If you were to take a nail and take a magnet and move it along the length of that nail in one direction only, and if you did that 20, 30, 40 times, this practice of subjecting this piece of iron to this magnetic influence, this piece of metal would then become magnetic independently. The idea being that, there's a certain principle involved in this whole subject of practice. The principle is that all matter at whatever level is conscious, is capable of responsiveness. And so to the degree that attention is focused on this matter, whether it be physical, emotional, mental matter, to that degree, currents of energy are generated that affect the structure and the composition of this material object. And again, we're using physical objects as our example, magnetism and a nail. But the exact same process is what we engage in anything that we deem to be a spiritual practice. And it has effects. In these days, we're quite aware, it used to be back in HPB's time, that she would make pronouncements about the effects of such things as meditation, the effect of regular exposure of the mind to high thinking, regular exposure of the emotions to high emotion, to devotion, to compassion. And she would state that these are things that result in a certain unfoldment and a certain level of development. And in her time, of course, the science of the day was not yet up to speed to be able to show demonstrations of this. Now, of course, it's something that's quite evident. They have done so many studies at this time about the effects of meditation practice. People always say the effects of meditation. But, quite honestly, most of the time when any of us are sitting during our quiet time, generally, just like people who are practicing music by playing scales, they're not playing music yet. Neither are we actually meditating normally. Meditation, I think I've shared this before. Many people, you may have heard me share this. My favorite definition of meditation. I looked around to try and have someone tell me what meditation was when I was just beginning with this. Now I look and we're talking about decades ago. It's amazing how the time moves. But trying to get some sort of clear-cut definition of what is meditation, and they were very hard to come by. The one that I came across that I found really hit the nail on the head once I understood it a little bit more deeply was one that came from a gentleman who was closely associated with the Theosophical Society, also with Tibetan Buddhism, a man by the name of Lama Anagarika Govinda. And when he was asked, what is meditation? I have to say, I really enjoy his reply because it's accurate and it's also very, I think, witty. But his response when asked, what is meditation? He said, meditation is not what you think. Meditation is not related to your thinking, to your thoughts, to the processes that are continually in movement of creating waves of thought and individual thoughts. Meditation is what we enter into at the point that we, in a sense, at the point that we pop above the water of the movement of thoughts. Thoughts become able to be observed. They also become able to be ignored. So meditation is what occurs not as we are sitting practicing, seeing the breath or whatever your practice is. It occurs when we move beyond the engagement in this thought process. So meditation practice has now been studied in a variety of ways, largely through brain imaging. And what it finds is this, that it has a dramatic effect on the brain. That in terms of actual physical structure of the brain, over a very short period of meditation practice, we're talking about months of meditation practice or a month of meditation practice, you find that there are synapses, the linkages between the neurons in the brain. The web of those increases. There are, with long-term meditators, there are parts of the brain that become, the matter in the brain becomes denser in areas, particularly in areas that are open to like open thought and, sort of compassionate response. Those areas become more pronounced. There is one particular area of the brain, physical structure within the brain, called the amygdala, which shrinks with time. The amygdala is that sort of, reptilian brain, that aspect of the brain structure that results in the fight or flight syndrome, what we engage in when we're fearful. That shrinks. And so our response to fear, our response to stressors are altered. So these are things that are demonstrable at this time. And so in many ways, practice is something that we engage in that has very definite results in terms of the physical brain structure, but also in terms of our capacity for higher emotions and other aspects, healing being one of them. So this is something that has been observed, and this is something that's part of the idea. So practice. And so when we're talking about inspiration, what is it that we practice? At the Feet of the Master, there is this quote that he gives related to study. When he says that we must study, but study first that which will most help you to help others. So in terms of a practice of inspiration, but we practice first that which will link us, that which will connect us to whatever we can describe as our highest source of power or of goodness. I mean, depending on our background and our, training over a period of a lifetime, you might think in terms of that which connects me to my higher self, that which connects me to God, to the inner self. Language Blavatsky would use as things like the Father in secret. Practice those things that create that sort of linkage. And we can talk a little bit about what we might mean by that. Inspiration. What is it? Excuse me. So inspiration, just as a word, has a very specific meaning. If you trace it to its roots, it relates to breathing into. Spirit is the breath, or spirit or the breath, and then, of course, in. So something that is breathed into us. And everybody has had the experience of inspiration. So when I talk about this, it's not too difficult for you to draw on your memories or your experiences of having been inspired. And this inspiration is something that generally comes to us from our contact with something, with a person, with an idea, with a scene of beauty, with art, with poetry, really depending on what our temperament is. The avenue through which this light shines into our world is what we then experience. And it has like a twofold aspect. In the presence, in the moment of the experience, we would describe ourselves as being inspired by something, inspired by the poetry, inspired by the words that the Dalai Lama has said, or the variety of inputs that create this sort of a moment of inspiration. So we are inspired by. Equally, we are also, one of the effects of this condition of inspiration is that we are also inspired to. We are inspired to express it. We are inspired to transmit it, to actualize it even in our own lives. So it has this sort of twofold aspect. Again, recently, in the scientific community, or in corners of the scientific community, there is some work being done actually on this subject of the nature of inspiration from a scientific point of view. In the Mahatma letters, it was said that science will be our greatest ally as far as the ageless wisdom. And so in some respects, you find these things popping up. But in order to first describe what is inspiration, or what are the qualities related to it, in this particular scientific study, they developed a threefold way of viewing it, which I like. I mean, as far as it goes, I think I do like it. The first aspect they talk about is that the inspirational experience is evocative, which is to say it's not something that we at will call down. It's not something that is controlled by the one who experiences it. So this is something that I think we find true for those times when we have actually been inspired. It's something that occurred. Often in hindsight, we can point and say it occurred because I was in the presence of that person, or because I was reading that poem, but we can't just invite it at will. I've had the very good fortune to, over the years, to have been in the presence of people who were, you could describe them as people of, of power in the sense of people who were really quite spiritually realized in their own lives. And it always has been so interesting to me how strange things happen in the presence of these people. What might occur for you and I, someone comes, they meet you, You say a few words, you greet them, they walk away, pretty much unchanged. But on a number of occasions, I have seen just things that speak to the transmission and the source point of this sort of inspiration. Some of you might have heard I shared at one point at the time when in the United States we had invited His Holiness the Dalai Lama to come, and he came and was with us for a couple of days. During that time, I had the opportunity to sort of hang around him for a couple of days and engage with him on occasion. But when he first arrived in Chicago, when his plane landed at the airport, it was a private airport, and went out to actually meet him at the plane. And there were a few people who were there. And the process is when he gets off the plane, you hand him a scarf and he puts it around your neck as a blessing, the kata, the scarf. So he did that with me, and then he did that with my wife, and my daughter was there also. My daughter knew very little about the Dalai Lama. She was just in latter time in high school then. She knew he was famous. And she knew he was famous for some spiritual things, but really, he wasn't on her radar at that time. But the Dalai Lama takes an interest in younger people just naturally. So he spoke to me, he spoke to my wife, then he came to my daughter and he spoke to her. She was getting ready to go to college, talked to her a little bit about that. 1-2 minutes maximum. And then he went on down the line, got in the car to go away. My daughter just breaks down in tears. And of course, I ask her why. How you doing? Put my arm around her. You okay, Angelique? And her response is what I'm sharing with you about this power of the person. Because what she said to me at the time was, the reason I'm crying, Dad, is because when he looked into my eyes, she said, I felt so strong. And that was the reason she was crying. This sudden upwelling of this sense of strength that came from nothing that was said, but from the connection to the person that was connected to this, deeper inner self is what communicates. So this is something that is really not controlled in any meaningful sense by us. The experience occurs, and then always one of the characteristics of inspirational experience is that it transcends our normal limits or our normal ideas. That's what makes it inspirational. It moves beyond whatever sort of circle of thinking, of feeling that we have become geared toward working within. So it's transcendent. And then beyond that, then there is also the motivational aspect of it. That anything that we might describe as a experience that is inspiring motivates us. And again, depending on our temperament, that will indicate the areas in which we express that. So it could be a physical involvement in some sort of work project where the body becomes energized. The emotions become focused and directed, and the mind. All of these things, this higher source touches all of them. When we're talking about real inspiration, we're not just talking about motivational speaking. There are a lot of people that can motivate people to get up out of their seat and just move and do, to emote. That's a common form of what's called motivational speaking. But that's only at a certain level. And in terms of what we're talking about, I would not refer to that as inspiration. From a theosophical point of view, really, real true inspiration is the light of Buddhi, the intuitional level, the light of Buddhi shining on the screen of the mind. In that occurrence is when we experience genuine inspiration. Of course, this is something that is always happening. It's not as if there are periods when Buddhi goes to sleep, and so that's why we don't experience it. Just like the sun that shines, it is always shining. The reason it doesn't fall to the earth and strike upon all things is because of the clouds that stand between it. These are clouds, we could say, of our own thinking, of our own sort of distorted emotions, distorted ways of living. Even in the mistreatment of the body, we block our exposure to higher influences. And so this is where the work begins. The whole idea of practice is not involved in correcting or manipulating Buddhi. It's involved in regulating and quieting, ideally the mind first, so that then it can have its effects and its impact on all of the aspects of the personality. In theosophical parlance, this effect of the light of Buddhi, the higher spiritual dimension, the dimension where the perception of oneness is the character of the experience. There's a name for that. I mean, we speak of it as the illumined mind, but there's the term manasa taijasi, the mind substance that is illuminated. And so this is at the higher levels of it. That's what we experience. And then it has its effects because we are multidimensional beings. It doesn't just affect one level. It's something that feeds its way into all aspects of our being, according to our capacity to actually respond. I mean, this is one of the things. Part of the point of practice, again, it's really no different than someone who determines that they're going to improve the quality of their diet. Because one of the very first things that happens as we start to eat quality levels of food is that toxins that have built up within the body are expelled. So part of the process of this practice, even at the level of diet, is that the materials that contradict or stand in the way of our higher nature are the things that are expelled. Equally, in this process of proper diet, whether it be physical or mental or emotional, higher quality materials come into the body, materials that are capable of functioning and vibrating at this different level. That's what we build into the body through whatever practice it is we engage in. So this is what's going on. I have a very good friend. He's a writer. And, nowadays I used to kind of criticize my daughter because I would ask her, when have you talked to your friend? One of her friends, she says, oh, I just talked to her an hour ago. I said, I didn't hear you on the phone. And it turns out that, of course, nowadays, talk and text are equal. So someone would tell you they talked to someone, you got to ask whether there were audible words or whether it was all done with the thumbs. But I don't criticize her anymore because now, of course, I have to do a lot more texting. But my good friend, the writer, he has a habit, these very short sorts of text messages. He's a lover of words, and he likes to really drop words. And he knows I also love it. He drives me to the dictionary about every 3 times we communicate. But, all sorts of words he puts into a text message. Words like peripatia, apophatic, quelling, legom. These are all words that are, workable English words, but they're not ones we use in normal conversation. The other day, he sent me a message and he was saying how he felt. Today I feel quite eudaimonic. EU and then daimonic, like a diamond. Not diamond, like the diamond of Socrates. And I had to look it up, of course. So eudaimonic or eudaimonia is a term. It has its roots in Greek and then it was Latinized, of course. But it relates to a feeling of well-being or happiness or uplift. But the root of the word is what's so fascinating to me. And I think it applies in what we're talking about here now. Because the word actually means, in its root, good spirit or good daimon, good spirit in the sense of an entity or a higher being. And the belief was, the approach to this was that in this process of being inspired, that there was a certain conveyance of higher or divine things that were transported into your mind, into your heart, by the means of this intermediary being between the earth and between the divine. And this was one of the ways that inspiration was regarded. And, throughout history, great people this has been the view of many great people of whom we are aware. Socrates being, of course, the most prominent, perhaps, because he was completely guided by the daimon that was his constant companion. And the way he always described it was that this presence never told him anything to do. It wasn't positive in terms of you must do this, but it would always try to interrupt his wrong behaviors or bad ideas. So this was the way that Socrates experienced this presence, even from his childhood. Apollonius, Plato, William Butler Yeats, the poet, William Blake, Gandhi was always talking about this inner voice that would speak to him. H.P. Blavatsky, she, everybody knows who has studied anything about her life and her history that she was an exceedingly strong-willed person. And, really almost a force of nature in terms of moving on the track on which she had committed herself. She made the statement that there are 2 voices which I unfailingly obey when I hear them. So when she heard either one of these 2 voices, her response was unfailing obedience, which is a rare word for her to apply to anything related to a voice. And those 2 voices were the voice of her higher self and the voice of her master, of course. So this idea that in part, whether it is part of our active awareness, Blavatsky was aware, Socrates was aware, but that there are in fact intermediary forces that are surround us, engage with humanity, but largely unaware. In one of the Mahatma letters, there was a wonderful expression that I like very much. I think he was talking to Sinnett, and he was describing how if Sinnett could better regulate his thinking and not engage in certain practices. I think Sinnett was one of the things Mahatma criticized or pointed out was, the habit of drink that, I guess Sinnett was into having his nightcap in the evenings. But that it was something that if he were to be able to regulate himself more clearly, then the thoughts of the master could be osmosed into your brain, is the way he put it. That they could cross across this filter that we normally maintain that prevents us from experience of deeper levels of being. I mean, one of the things that I think the Theosophical Society came into existence to reaffirm is that we live in an intelligent universe. We are surrounded continually, not just by intelligence in the abstract, but by various different forms through which intelligence is expressed, whether we think of it in terms of beings or patterns, that this is part of the makeup of the universe, to the point that there is no such thing as empty space. I mean, even at the most basic level that we're accustomed to, wherever it is we're sitting at the moment, we are surrounded in microwaves, in television waves, radio waves, the internet, all of these things, if we are capable of communicating, if we are capable, in this case, we have a computer, so we can dial it to the proper frequency and see each other and talk to each other. But similarly, I mean, beyond the radio spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, there is intelligence. And in the cases of people such as Socrates or HPB or Gandhi or the others, in large measure, their practice had removed certain barriers to a deeper experience of the intelligence that is continually around them. And so this is one other aspect we can think of as possibly a source of inspiration. So HPB also, let me just share a quote. In first Key to Theosophy, she was writing about, I don't know if it was specifically inspiration, but I think it applies. She says, we believe, speaking about what Theosophists believe, we believe in communion and in simultaneous action in unison with our Father in secret. And in rare moments of ecstatic bliss, the mingling of our higher soul with the universal essence. And so this is a description of a very high moment of inspirational experience where the soul mingles, our higher soul mingles with the universal essence. There's a beautiful description of this in The Light of Asia, Edwin Arnold's description of the life and enlightenment of the Buddha, where the term that's used is that the dewdrop slips into the shining sea. The idea that the drop of water that we could think of as our soul has its moment of merging with the shining sea, the endless body from which it is emanated and which gives it its meaning, its purpose, its existence. The dewdrop slips into it. She talks about mingling. So it's something that takes place much like most of our experiences, where it's something that takes place and then we return, not quite the same. We return changed, but we return to the personality and the experiences of our, what we would describe as our day-to-day life, having mingled, having had that sense of inspiration, being breathed into. So I think maybe at this point, I could just talk about a couple of possible avenues along which we could, one could cultivate and put yourselves in the, create the possibility for the experience of inspiration. There's an expression about enlightenment, and it says that enlightenment is an accident. In other words, it's not something we control. Enlightenment is an accident, but spiritual practice makes us accident prone. I very much like that expression. The possibility for enlightenment, if you think that you are going to will your way into it and power your way into it, maybe you'll be the first one that does, but it doesn't seem to work that way. In many respects, we put ourselves in the neighborhood and we prepare ourselves to be open for this unexpected, non-personally controllable experience to take hold of us. So one requirement, I'll talk about three different things, but one requirement for any of them is that to some degree, we have to either have the temperament or have done the necessary personal work that we have a capacity for quiet, that we have cultivated the capacity to, at least to some degree, still our minds, quiet down the ever barking hounds of desire. With that as an entree, then these other things have the possibility of allowing us an experience of inspiration. Basically, we learn to, at least temporarily, still the constant waves of thought. So probably one of the ways in which inspiration as this really catalyzing influence is available is in nature. At this point in the world, nature is becoming a more and more remote thing. It was never the case in past history, but now, of course, the majority of people living on the planet live in urban centers where nature is the tree that's planted in the sidewalk for many. So, but even that, human energy patterns tend to be fragmented, tend to be chaotic very often. Although they tend to be organized, they are fragmented and fragmenting. I know someone once asked, what was the greatest invention ever come up with in humankind? So people say things like the computer or maybe even the wheel. But for some people, they would say that the greatest invention that was ever invented by humans is the light bulb. the thing that we take for granted every single day. Because with the advent of the light bulb came the possibility to distort a basic rhythm, natural rhythm, that human bodies, animal bodies, plants respond to, the circadian rhythm of the sun's rising, the sun setting. And so with that, many other things have become possible, such as night shifts on the job, stoplights in the street where if you're walking and a red light comes on, we are trained to stop and go no farther. All of these sorts of human-imposed rhythms tend to be rather fragmented. But in nature, it is necessarily stable energy patterns. The growing of the trees, the movement of the branches and the leaves in the wind, these are all stable patterns. The movement of the wind, the flowing of the river. These are things that are stabilizing. It's no accident the great theosophist and also the great psychoanalytic force of the early 20th century, William James. He wrote a book that many of you probably are acquainted with, Varieties of Religious Experience. And it was his observation that the majority of all mystical experiences take place in nature. Not while we're fighting our way in traffic or in the boardroom, negotiating the deal. So these are things that our exposure to be able to, with a quiet mind, expose ourselves to nature. Again, no willful activity is required, just the quieting. I have been in forests in different places around the world where setting foot in that forest without even having a thought about it, I and anyone around me, you find yourself whispering. That in the presence of this space in which we have placed ourselves, speak low. And very often, in the theosophical history, we have such people as Jeffrey Hodson and C.W. Leadbitter and Dora Kuntz and others who would speak about the great beings. In Indian spirituality, we speak of the devas or the angelic beings that inhabit different places in the natural world. And so these are things that we find ourselves exposing ourselves to. Even if you're at home and you have a plant, or if you have a bird feeder, in the presence of the stabilizing rhythms and patterns of nature, we create an opportunity, a possibility for a higher form of knowing to have access to us. And so that's one way. Another avenue toward inspiration is to be found in spiritual community. In India and other places, they speak in terms of Sangha. And the thing with that is, HPB made a statement that probably it didn't require HPB to make us aware of this, but she made the statement, and something that I'm too aware of, I'm afraid, that personality is the curse of the Theosophical Society and every place else. Our very highly treasured sense of self, the ways we express emotions, our highly tuned thought, our good looks, whatever it is that we identify with, which is of the nature of personality, is the largest problem, not only for ourselves, but even for the things that we value and that we love. All of us would want for the Theosophical Society or any spiritual path or organization to flourish. And yet, somehow we can't help ourselves. We have to express our personality, and it creates difficulties. One of the beauties of spiritual community is that, in a manner, the isolated personality, which is also something that in our particular time we find ourselves being encouraged to cultivate and project, that this isolated personality is, to some degree, subsumed, made a part of a greater whole, a greater expression. And there's also this sort of, I guess you could call it a principle in the spiritual realm that is expressed, it's expressed this way in the Bible, but when they say, wherever two or more gather in my name, there I am in the midst of them. So wherever you find a community of people whose focus is on something deeper, there the presence of that very thing, that consciousness, is attracted and functions through that center and magnifies the experience of everybody involved with that. This is something that's been known certainly in spiritual communities throughout history. So for us, even as we sit now in this virtual spiritual community, all of us are here, and all of us have our own kind of individual reasons and needs just in being here. But it's been my experience over time. I'm less certain of it with virtual, but I see no reason why it wouldn't apply, that when two or more of us gather together, this time in the name of inspiration, that very often it is the case. We sit, we hear ideas, we think, we process a lot of the things that we do. But very often there are moments when, as a group, there is something of another nature that flows through this gathering. It's not information. It's not a visual sensation. We find ourselves connecting with some aspect of the consciousness which really has drawn us all together. And so that's the value of spiritual community. So to the extent that we have the opportunity or create the opportunity to connect with others along this line, again, we open ourselves up for this transformative possibility of being inspired, of being breathed into. Third thing I would say, and the last one, would be that without a spiritual community, with or without a spiritual community, with or without a direct connection with nature, we have a potential that I think is very often underutilized. And this is a potential of consciousness. And it is something that is getting a lot of attention these days. I think so much so that it might be becoming trivialized. But we have the capacity to generate a state of consciousness that is expansive. And it is accomplished through a very simple mechanism. So we could speak in terms of the description, the word that I would use would be gratitude. Gratitude. Or appreciation, perhaps a milder form of gratitude. And it's not just a matter of acknowledging all of the very good things that have occurred to us and being thankful for that. That's a wonderful thing. It's something we should do. But I think, at least for me, I have yet to meet the person who has not had difficult experiences flow into their lives, who has not had moments of hardship, rejection, shame, pain, all of the different things that come with being born into a human body and living in this world. And although it's difficult, very difficult, while those moments of suffering are occurring, to recognize the capacity they have for opening us to deeper dimensions of our consciousness. As we practice in this practice of being thankful, of being grateful, and you can begin at any point, anywhere you look can be a beginning point, because this is a meeting of a theosophical group. We are thankful for really the birth, the rebirth, the reintroduction of this theosophical movement into this world at a time when we are present to experience it. That hasn't always been the case. But you get the idea. The practice is something that builds something within us. And here it is. Really, when you get right down to it, anything that we experience in the nature of inspiration, basically, it all comes back to kind of the very first principle of our theosophical movement. It was expressed in terms of to create a nucleus of the universal brotherhood. I often just express it as the idea that what is to unfold within us ultimately is the recognition of the oneness, the unity, not just of human beings, but of all life. And in that process, this self-cherishing mentality that all of us carry minimally becomes diminished, but at times moves into a sense of actually the absence of self, no self on the horizon. It's temporary, of course, but the experience roots us in an awareness of the possibility for the actual perception and the living of unity, of oneness. Even in her diagram of meditation, when HPB was sharing this idea, I think it was with Sturdy, the very first thing she says, lists a number of things about acquisitions and deprivations in this process of meditating. The very first thing she says is, first, conceive of unity. First, conceive of unity. If we go no farther than that, if we reach to the point where we actually are imbued with the experience of unity, not just even a conception, then really there's no farther to go. So these are a few ideas about practice and about inspiration. And again, from my point of view, always, Theosophy is rich in knowledge and in thoughts and in ideas and conceptually rich. And all of them, we should turn toward application. What does it mean to practice? What does inspiration mean? How does this affect the way that I live? How is unity involved in everything that we do, that we think, every possibility that opens for us? So just a few thoughts. As always, I'm very thankful that you would think it worthwhile to take the time. And at this point, I guess I turn it over to you, Erica. Yes?
Thank you so much, Tim, for such a wonderful and inspiring lecture.